This is the longest war in history. At 3,452 years long, it's almost impossible to wrap your mind around the idea of a war lasting over 3,000 years. But this one has been raging for all that time with no end in sight. In fact, there have only been 3 years where the warring factions have agreed to lay down their arms. The longest war in history began back in 1279 BC, when the Egyptians were fighting against the Hyksos. Back then, the Egyptian Empire was in decline and the Hyksos people had seized control of the Sinai Peninsula. The Egyptians wanted it back, and so they went to war. But they weren't prepared for what was coming. The Hyksos army was led by a military genius named Shoshenq I. He defeated the Egyptians decisively at the Battle of Kadesh, which to this day is considered one of the greatest battles in history. Unfortunately for the Egyptians, it wasn't the only battle that they lost. Shoshenq I went on to conquer the entire Egyptian empire, including its capital city of Thebes. After 200 years of Hyksos rule, the Egyptians finally kicked them out. But even though the Egyptians won, they never got their revenge. And that's because Shoshenq I's grandson, Ramses II, went on to become one of the most famous pharaohs in history. In fact, he was so famous that the Greeks and Romans considered him a god, but despite his divine status, he couldn't defeat the Hittites. Ramses II fought them in the Battle of Kadesh, but it ended in a stalemate. He then tried again at the Battle of Raphia, but once again it ended in a draw. So, the Hittite Empire remained standing. For their part, the Hittites didn't seem to mind the stalemate. They basically said, hey, we're not going to turn down a free pass to Egypt, and moved into the Egyptian capital city of Thebes. For the next 500 years, the Egyptians and Hittites shared the city. Kind of like roommates who can't stand each other, but have to live together. Finally, in 653 BC, the Assyrians came along and destroyed the Hittite Empire. But the Egyptians didn't celebrate because they were soon conquered by the Persians. For the next 350 years, the Egyptians suffered under the rule of the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. Finally, in 30 BC, Cleopatra and her lover, Mark Antony, kicked the Romans out of Egypt. But their victory was short-lived. Soon after, Cleopatra died, and Egypt became a province of Rome. Over the next 600 years, Egypt changed hands several times. It was ruled by Arabs, then by the Byzantines, and then by the Arabs again. Finally, in 1517, Egypt came under the control of the Ottoman Empire. At this point, you might think that the Egyptians would be pretty war-weary, but no. As soon as the Ottomans took over, they went to war with the Hyksos again. This time, the Ottomans were victorious and pushed the Hyksos back into the mountains of Lebanon. But even though the Ottomans won, they didn't get any land. You see, by this point, the Egyptian Empire had shrunk so much that it no longer existed. Instead of conquering the entire region, the Ottomans just took over what was left of the Egyptian capital city of Cairo. Still, they held on to it for 400 years, until 1917, when the British came along and took it from them. And that brings us to today. The longest war in history has been raging between the Egyptians and the Hyksos for over 3,000 years. It's lasted through ancient times, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and World War II. The Egyptians have fought against the Hyksos for so long that they have forgotten why they even fighting. And historians have been unable to uncover the true origins of the conflict. Some say it's because the Hyksos invaded Egypt and the Egyptians wanted revenge. But that doesn't make sense because the Hyksos helped the Egyptians defeat the Nubians and the Assyrians. Others say it's because the Hyksos were foreigners who didn't belong in Egypt. But that's not true either because the Greeks and Romans were foreigners too. But the Egyptians never went to war with them. So what's the real reason? We may never know. But that hasn't stopped the Egyptians from fighting. For 3,000 years, they've been willing to put aside their differences and unite against a common enemy. And maybe that's the real reason why the war has lasted so long. The Hyksos may be a small and relatively weak nation, but they're fierce fighters who never give up. The Egyptians have tried everything to defeat them, but nothing has worked. Maybe it's time they just accept the situation and make peace with the Hyksos. After all, they've been fighting for so long that they've become more or less family. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.